Gosh, okay, not only the technical difficulties, man, oh man. There's some things that like just incite fear in a person's heart, things like that. Like, we're preparing for this whole thing. We want it to go great. We want you to be able to pray at home and with us here. And then it's like, what the heck? Last night it went smoothly, except for, so you might know that we have, if you've been coming to Mass with us for the last couple of weeks, we have about 4 people who I've assisted at Mass with proclaiming the Word, and with prayers of the faithful, that kind of stuff. And people are like, wait, who are those people? Are they going to Mass? They are our Focus missionaries. Focus stands for the Fellowship of Catholic University Students, and they've been on our campus. And they've been, we're all quarantined together for the last 4 weeks, like a month plus. And so like, why are they standing so close? Are they married? No, but they are. But then we have been quarantined together, and so it's kind of part of the same crew, right? But last night I was mad at them because, not really mad, but kind of, because there's this thing called the Exultet. If you ever go to the Easter Vigil, it's the song that the priest or deacon or someone has to do it. It's a cappella. It's long. It's like 35 minutes, maybe not exactly. But I'm not the best singer in the world. Like, I mean, I wouldn't really. I would not win Gregorian Idol. We'll say that for the chant division last night. But so I realized, like, I used to think that I was a good singer, and then I heard myself recorded, and I was like, oh, that's what I sound like. I do not sound like I think I sound in my head. And because of that, I kind of developed a little bit of not a phobia. Well, we'll call it a fear, Some people have fears of doing anything in public, like standing in public, going out in public. Some people have fears of speaking in public. In fact, you might have heard this, that the number 1 fear of Americans is public speaking. The number 2 fear of Americans is death. And so maybe you heard the Jerry Seinfeld thing where he said, if you go to a funeral, if that's true, if you go to a funeral, you'd rather be the one in the casket than the one giving the eulogy. But we have fears, and we have pains, and all of us, we have real, genuine fears right now. Like real, genuine fears. Like death is it's a genuine fear. I know so many of us right now are spending a lot of time alone, and that is the fear. Being alone is the incredible, sometimes overwhelming fear. And because of what we're going through right now, it seems like this fear upon fear, we not only have death, we not only have people dying, but we have many people who are dying alone. And the question comes back, like, what do you do with that? Like, how do we face that? Not just death and not just loneliness, but even those 2 things together. How do we face this fear of dying alone? And I think one of the ways is we recognize today. We not just recognize today. We acknowledge, we profess the faith of today, which is that Jesus Christ has conquered death. The resurrection changes everything. Let's say that again. The resurrection is the one thing that changes everything. Because up until this point, I find Jesus interesting, but I can still ignore him. The thing we're professing today, the fact that he died and then he rose from the dead, because either the resurrection happened or it didn't. It's not a matter of opinion. It's not a matter of like, well, this is how I feel about this. This is my perspective. It's not a matter of like, Father, I appreciate if you're a Christian, you believe Jesus rose from the dead. That's your truth. My truth is that he didn't. No, he either did or he didn't. See, that's the thing I love about being a Catholic Christian. Our faith is not based off of a feeling. It's not based off of a myth. It's not based off a legend. It's based off of a fact. You guys realize this. If you're a Christian, you have the only historical religion in existence. That we don't merely base what we believe off of a philosophy. We base what we believe off of a fact. Our faith is based off of facts. And that's what even St. Peter says in Acts chapter 10 today. St. Peter is saying, he's not saying like, hey guys, we all, we think this could be true. We think this could be our opinion. We think this could be a nice idea or a wishful thinking or a way to cope with fear in the face of death or in the face of loneliness. St. Peter says, no, he says, we saw him. We were witnesses. He used that word. He uses it a bunch in Acts chapter 10. He says, we were witnesses. We were witnesses of his life. We were witnesses of his death. And we were witnesses of the fact that he rose from the dead. This isn't just a feeling. This isn't just a legend. In fact, think about this. Peter didn't say, well, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, this random thing happened of someone you've never heard of, you've never known, by people, to people whom you never heard of, never known. Some people will say that, well, Christians might have invented the resurrection decades after Christ or centuries after Christ. Actual scholars have pointed out that the earliest creed, the earliest profession of this fact, of this faith, dates back not to hundreds of years after Christ, not decades after Christ, months after the resurrection. Within mere months of the resurrection, there was already among Christian people a creed proclaiming this fact. And that's why St. Peter says, I saw this. He doesn't say, I saw it. He says, we saw this. Like, don't just take my word for it. Take the word of all these other people. And yet, let's hold on. Who are these other people? Who are the other witnesses? I mean, they weren't the best human beings in the world. They weren't necessarily the people that you would say, they weren't necessarily the people you would say would be the kind of people who've never failed. You have Thomas, the doubter. You have James and John, the ambitious brothers. You have Peter, the denier, and foot in mouth putter. You have the other apostles who all ran away. You have Mary Magdalene in today's gospel. Mary Magdalene, who Jesus had to deliver. She was possessed by 7 demons, and Jesus had to exorcise her. So even think about Mary Magdalene. I mean, if they had made this story up, if it didn't happen, they would have not included the fact that Peter denied Jesus. They wouldn't have included the fact that Thomas doubted. They wouldn't have included the fact that James and John were ambitious. They included all these facts because that's how it happened. In fact, Mary Magdalene, being the one, she's the apostle to the apostles, right? She's the first witness to the resurrection. If you were making up this story in the first century, you definitely would not write it this way. Why? Because in that first century context, you would not place the critical event of everything you believe in the mouth of a woman, just because she didn't have any authority, didn't have any influence. She didn't have what they would consider to be a reliability. You would never make up a story like this. You never tell a story like this unless this is how it happened. All these things are pointing to that. They include the stories of their own flaws. They include the story of yes, this is the truth because this is how it happened. And even St. Paul, who was he? Before the resurrection, before he encountered Jesus, he was a persecutor of Christians. He arrested Christians. He would beat Christians. He's a murderer. And he fought Christianity until what moment? Until the moment that he met, that he encountered, that he witnessed the risen Jesus. And that witnessing of the risen Jesus is the one thing that changes everything. It is the one thing that changed everything in Paul's life. In fact, it's so important, this is so essential, it's so critical, that Paul even points to this and says, if the resurrection didn't happen, he says this, if the resurrection didn't happen, if it's not an actual fact, then everyone who believes in it is among the most to be pitied in the world. The most pitiable. He says, if the resurrection didn't happen, your faith is not only false, it's worthless. He says, if the resurrection didn't happen, your faith is in vain. It's worthless. And you've died in your sins. Because why? Because the resurrection is the one thing that changes everything. That's why again and again and again, the disciples, the apostles, St. Paul, all profess this fact. And again, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul says, he throws on the gauntlet. He's like, okay, this is not just, again, not a feeling, not a philosophy, not a legend. People saw this. He goes in 1 Corinthians 15, he says, I had what I handed on to you of first importance. Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures. Then he was buried. That he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, that he appeared to Kepha, that's Peter, then to the 12. Apparently he left out Mary Magdalene, whatever. Gosh, Paul, come on, man. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at once, most of whom are still living, although some have fallen asleep. After that, he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, as to one born abnormally, he appeared to me. St. Paul is saying, witnesses. Again, this is a fact. In fact, he goes on to say that whole thing about he appeared to 500 people at once. He says, most are alive. Some have fallen asleep. But why does he say that? He says, because you can go and ask them. They were all gathered, and there was Jesus, who had died, but then was alive. This is the one thing that changes everything. I mean, think about I don't know if you've ever heard someone deny the resurrection. They say, well, maybe the apostles just made it up. Maybe the disciples they made up the whole story. In fact, that was the first accusation, right? The first in the Gospels, it says that the Romans told the guards to tell people that the disciples came and stole the body of Jesus. Like that was like the party line. The word was going to be, hey, listen, tell people that the disciples came and stole the body. Which is really interesting because you think, yeah, maybe that's the case. Maybe that's what happened. But what does it admit? It admits the fact that the tomb was empty. It admits the fact that the body was gone, that the body was no longer where they put it. And so, yeah, so maybe the disciples stole Jesus' body. That's a reasonable explanation, except for this fact. Every one of the disciples, every one of the apostles, they were unanimous. They were united and they were unequivocal about this central fact, this central truth, that Jesus was dead and that now he was alive. Every one of them. No one denied it. In fact, this is the fact they profess. This is the faith they profess. Maybe they were lying. Maybe they made it all up. Again, just go to maybe they were at the point where they were just like, no, this is the story we're all going to tell and we're going to become rich and famous. It's funny because there's a kind of a modern corollary to this. In 1973, March of 1973, there was what you probably know as the Watergate investigation. So Chuck Colson, you might have heard of him. He was part of the Watergate scandal. He was known as Nixon's hatchet man. And he tells the story because afterwards he became a Christian. He tells the story, he says that when all this broke in March 1973, there were about a dozen men surrounding Nixon who were part of the scandal, part of part of Watergate. And he says that they all agreed that they would cover it up. They all agreed, here's what we're going to say. They all agreed that, no, listen, and these were powerful men, these were intelligent men, these are successful men, these are, according to Colson, a dozen of the most influential human beings in American politics. And they all agreed, this is what we're going to say. Within days of this, a man named John Dean cracked and turned state's evidence. And he said the reason he did it is to save his own skin. That was John Dean at first. And then within less than 3 weeks, just over 2 weeks, every single one of these dozen men had turned state's evidence. They all broke down and told the truth. That was the most powerful men in America in the 70s. Just to save their own skin, they told the truth. The apostles, what did they get? If this was a lie, what did they get for their lie? Well, you have Peter and Andrew, the brothers, both crucified. You have St. Paul, who was tortured multiple times and beheaded. You have Thomas, the apostle, who in India was stabbed to death with a spear. You have Matthew, the tax collector, who was stabbed to death with knives. You have James, who was beaten to death with clubs. You have Matthias, who replaced Judas, who witnessed the resurrection. Matthias witnessed this. He was burned alive. The only apostle who wasn't killed for professing what he witnessed, professing this faith, professing this fact, was John the apostle. And John wasn't martyred, but he was boiled alive in oil. And every single one of these apostles, every single one of these witnesses, even at their last moment, were unanimous, unified, and unequivocal, but professing this fact, their faith. Because here's the thing, it is one thing to profess the faith, it is another thing to persevere in the faith. Their witness proves what they witnessed to. Their perseverance proved what they professed. That they hadn't made it up, that the resurrection is as real a fact as the fact that the sun comes up every morning. And this is what you and I are called to profess as well. This is what you and I do profess as well. This is why we're on the internet right now on a Sunday morning, because we profess the fact of the resurrection. And this is faith. C.S. Lewis he became a Christian, but earlier in his life he was an atheist. And he said that when he was an atheist, he never understood how Christians would talk about faith as a virtue. It's like, it doesn't make any sense to have faith as a virtue. He says, because why? Because if something is true, something's a fact, there's nothing morally good about believing it. If something's a fact, there's nothing morally good about professing it. It's just like, it's true, so you believe it. But then he said he became a Christian, and he realized that it is one thing to profess the faith, and it is another thing to persevere in the faith. Because here we are right now, professing our faith, professing this fact. And maybe right now, it's kind of easy. We always know that the day comes when I don't want it to be true. Working on college campus, we have this experience, right? You have a high schooler who, they know the fact of the resurrection. They know the fact of Christianity. They know the fact of Jesus. But then you get all this freedom on campus. You get this anonymity on campus, and you're like, I don't want this to be true, because if it's not true, I can do whatever I want. If it's not true, I can live however I want. And there's this desire sometimes when I don't necessarily want to persevere in the faith. I don't necessarily want to live out this fact. It's hard to do that because we also know that the day comes when it's inconvenient. There's how many work with youth ministers and work with teens all the time, and they have this situation where they've encountered Jesus. They know he's risen from the dead. They know he's established the Catholic Church. They know all of this is true, but it's inconvenient now because their friends of theirs in high school used to profess this, but now they've fallen away, and it's like, man, now I'm on the outside, and it's no longer convenient. I no longer have the support of my friends, and so now it's one thing to profess the faith. It's another thing to persevere in the faith. Because there are some truths that make no difference to my life, and there are some truths that make all the difference. I know you probably, when it comes to your lives, when it comes to your work, you're going to be so busy. When it comes to all the demands that are placed on you, all the responsibilities that you have, like, man, there's so many people who count on you, or maybe you find yourself in a place where it's just like, I don't know where God fits. There's some truths that make no difference in our lives, and there's some truths that make all of the difference. The resurrection is one of those truths. It has to touch my work, has to touch my responsibilities, has to touch my family. Because there are some truths that demand something of me. There are some truths that ask something of me. And the resurrection is one of those truths. The resurrection is one of those facts. The resurrection is the one thing that changes everything. Because even in a time of fear, the resurrection changes everything. Even in a time of uncertainty, complete uncertainty, the resurrection changes everything. Even in the face of dying alone, the resurrection is still true. And so we profess the faith. So we persevere in the faith. So we're witnesses, just like the apostles, they were witnesses. And I think, remember, all of them had time to change their mind. They all had time, if it didn't really happen, they all had time to recant. But they were unanimous. They were unified, and they were unequivocal about this fact. The resurrection happened. And they all died. And the resurrection was still true. They all died, and the resurrection is still true. Here's an interesting thing. It's something I've been praying about for the last while now. I don't know if you've ever thought about this or ever realized this, but every single one of the apostles, not only did they die, they all died alone. Every one of them died alone. Right now, that's what so many of our family members face. That is what so many of our friends are facing. That's what so many of us are facing. Death and loneliness. And yet the resurrection is still true. And that's why we profess this faith today. so we can persevere in this faith tomorrow. That's why we profess this fact today, so we can persevere in this fact tomorrow. Because if this is true, then it's all true. This is the one thing that changes everything. If this is true, if the resurrection is true, then God knows your name. He actually does know your name. And he loves you. If the resurrection is true, then God has not forgotten you. He's with you. If the resurrection is true, then Jesus really does give us his body and blood in the Eucharist. Even if you can't get to Mass, if the resurrection is true, then Jesus is the one who said, I am the bread of life. This is my body. This is my blood. That's true. If the resurrection is true, then Jesus Christ has given his priests the ability to forgive sins. And you don't have to die in your sins. You don't have to die hopeless. You don't have to hold on to them. You can actually hand them over to the Lord. Jesus Christ established a church on this earth. When in Matthew chapter 16, he said, and you are Peter, you are a rock, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And you're part of that church. If this is true, if the resurrection is true, Jesus Christ established a church, he established a family, and you are part of that family. And one of the things that means is there is no place on this earth that you can go where you're going to be alone. There's no place, even in your home, where you can be where you're totally alone. There is no place, the ends of the earth, you could find yourself. There's no place you could ever go where you're abandoned. Because if you belong to him, if the resurrection is true, then you belong to him. If the resurrection is true, then none of us walk alone. None of us live alone. If the resurrection is true, even if we die, none of us die alone. Because this is the one thing that changes everything. This is the fact that we profess. This is the fact that we persevere in. Jesus Christ has conquered the grave. And he will never leave you alone.